to my knowledge, just almost universally, when you correct mouth breathing, you correct a lot of things. You correct cancer risk, you correct obesity.
Can you talk to us about breathing real quick? Because you mentioned breathing, and it's really interesting how much more breathing is being like talked about currently. For example, we had Andrew Zaragoza on our last podcast, but in his podcast about testosterone, he literally had a whole section on why nasal breathing is massively important for hormonal and testosterone health, nasal breathing specifically. So what about breathing helps the production of ATP? And something I've noticed for myself, and I mentioned this to Mark this morning, I typically try to use mouth tape every night. And on the nights I forget, I don't use an alarm, but I sleep longer. On the nights that I use mouth tape, every single time I sleep like 45 minutes less. I wake up energized. I'm just like, I can hop out of bed. Always I need less sleep. What might be going on?
Have you measured your deep sleep one versus the other and your heart rate variability one versus the other?
My HRV is usually a little bit better when I have mouth tape on. Right. Deep sleep can vary depending on the time that I go to bed on certain nights. Some nights that I go to bed at 12:30, some nights that I go to bed at like 11. So it ranges there. But always I sleep less and wake up feeling more energized when I use mouth tape. And it's not like when I don't use mouth tape, it's not like I wake up with a dry mouth, but my mouth sometimes is probably falling open a little bit here and there throughout the night when I don't use mouth tape versus when I do. So I'm just curious about that.
Yeah, well, I know some of the research in that talks about that you're, and especially when you talk to like some of the dentists that are really on the forefront of that, which you find some of the people that know the most about that are dentists that are really into this. You oxygenate the brain better. So that's one component of it. I think another piece, just generally speaking, is that in order to make ATP, your primary fuel source is not food, it's oxygen. So you pull oxygen into oxphos, and that's how you're making all that ATP. So you have kind of a linear equation with respect to oxygen and ATP production. So the less oxygen, the less ATP you make. And I'm trying to think of the research I've seen on mouth breathers. I think, to my knowledge, just almost universally, when you correct mouth breathing, you correct a lot of things. You correct cancer risk, you correct obesity. So what you see, this is really interesting. When you look at childhood obesity rates, first of all, this isn't any one thing. It's a bunch of things that are tied together. But when you look at like childhood obesity rates, the absence of chewing hard foods and a lot of, okay, and this is a radical opinion within dentistry, but a guy you should have on the podcast is Dr. Gregory Kleiben. Man, this guy is the nicest guy you're ever going to meet in your life. Super nice guy and really knowledgeable, and he can really speak to this stuff. But just to paraphrase some stuff he might tell you, what you see is some of the older orthodontic techniques, they were based on removing things from the jaw. And so what happens is the jaw and the facial structure never properly develops. You know, there's a whole bunch of epigenetics going on here. There's a whole bunch of gene stimulation from the ability to chew and chew hard foods. And so what you see with childhood obesity rates is there's these high correlations with chewing soft foods, with improper airway flow. And so some of the net things that you see from that is kind of this thing. You'll see kind of this kind of posture leaning forward. And the reason you see that is because you're unconsciously need to get more air. So you see kind of this humpback kind of, posture. Like, and you could test it. You could just, okay, well, stand really straight and breathe. Oh, I'm not getting as much air. Put your head forward. Oh yeah, I get more air. Okay. But a lot of that is coming from the lack of development of the palate and the mouth. And there's a book I'm reading right now called Epigenetic Orthodontics. Okay. And it's incredible. Like the pictures that you see in this book of the facial correction that goes on when people undergo the expansion of the palate.
I know that sometimes people start to hear this stuff and they think that we're crazy because we've been talking about this for quite some time. But like, my understanding is that there's some stem cell production from chewing on hard things, and that's what helps kind of recorrect. And we're not really saying that that mouth breathing is causing people to be heavier, because we know what the root cause. But as Joel pointed out, it can be another issue that compounds a already complicated issue. And so people's decision-making skills, you can start to just think about on days when you're really, really tired, think about your decision-making skills and how poor they are. And so now think about if you started to feel that way every single day because you had sleep apnea or some sort of obstructed breathing, not just during sleep, but even throughout the entire day. now you're really screwed, and it's going to be very difficult to make changes or want to investigate what's going on with your diet. It's going to be that much harder for you to be able to kind of fight against it.
Power Project family, what if I told you that you could eat cereal that doesn't mess with your diet, that doesn't have massive amounts of sugar, that doesn't give you the bubble guts, and that's actually really good for you? Well, that's why we partnered with the Magic Spoon. 0 grams of sugar, 4 grams of net carbs, 14 grams of protein, and 140 calories per serving, and it actually tastes like kid cereal. God dang it. Andrew, how can people get it?
Absolutely. You guys got to head over to magicspoon.com/powerproject, and that'll get you $5 off the variety pack. Links to them down in the description. Let's get back to this video.
I have seen from coaching clients, I've seen things like, I have seen, whole body resonance imaging of like the airway. Okay. And you can literally see these tiny airways that are restricting airflow. Okay. And these are things that if you just run the math on what your probabilistic outcomes are, you need oxygen to make ATP. In my book, I talk a lot about the hypoxia protein, HIF1. So our body has a backup system when you don't have food. That's called body fat. It also has a backup system when you don't have air. Okay, that's called HIF1. And basically each cell controls its own sort of need for oxygen tension. Oxygen tension is kind of like a little lever, a little meter that says, we don't have any oxygen. Let's go to the backup system. What you see hand in hand with lots of different types of cancers is when you have sustained hypoxia as a whole and within cells, you see this high correlation to cancer. And it's because you're not getting enough oxygen, because your cells start running on glycolysis. Okay. And then you see sort of these inflammatory mediators, and you see these inflammatory cascades within immune cells that, and the way to understand it is in my book, I talk about the macrophage as kind of like a central focus point. The macrophage is a white blood cell, and they're kind of like the SWAT team. They're like the SWAT team of the body. They patrol and, they see something that's out of whack and they go kill it. Okay. But they're also the body's doctors. And so they kind of have dual roles. And there's a time when sometimes you need a SWAT team, sometimes you need a doctor. But what you see with macrophages is generally when you have issues with hypoxia, they show up because there's a problem, and the metabolism of the SWAT team macrophages is very inflammatory by its nature. And that's necessary. You need it to kill things. But when there's too much of that, the whole system gets wonky, and you get these inflammatory cascades that are very oncogenic in nature. So when you look at like restricted airflow, you see these very high correlations to cancer and obesity, and it starts in childhood. So just simple things like in childhood, correcting airflow and reintroducing back a number of different small things. I don't think there's any one cure, but introducing back hard chewing and a number of other things, I think over the long term can pay huge dividends. And in saying that, I understand there's a lot of orthodontists out there and dentists that would be violently opposed to that idea. That's just BS. It's like ridiculous. There's a small contingent of dental professionals that are sort of really looking at this and seeing pretty amazing results. So time will tell. But given just personally what I've seen and the way I've seen people like correct their energy just by correcting sleep at night, by just breathing through the nose, I would literally lay money on time will favor that sort of position.